The war had ended 1,000 years ago, yet somehow humanity still carried its scars among the stars. Wind carved old bones of mountains into pillars and thrones, and the sun moved like a tired lantern over a valley no map remembered. Dry grass whispered. Stones remembered footsteps that had stopped long ago. At the center of that quiet stood a girl who had run out of names. She had once answered to many. Daughter, sister, apprentice, shepherd, little comet. Those were the words in a world that had water and songs. But the river died, and the bridges of glass cracked, and the old names loosened and fell from her like dead leaves. Now she was just a thin figure wrapped in sun-dulled cloth, black hair roped by grit, hands scarred from prying food from stubborn earth. She sat on a rock and listened to the wind explain that nothing lasted. A sound interrupted, the kind that doesn't belong in a dead valley. Heavy, measured, not like a beast and not like a machine. Footsteps with patience in them. He came from the East Pass, tall and broad, carrying a slab of stone across his shoulders as if he meant to argue with gravity until it gave up. He wore patched canvas and boots glossed with clay. His skin looked carved by the same weather that had cut the valley, his jaw shadowed, eyes steady. He wasn't young and he wasn't old, and when he reached her rock, he set down the slab as carefully as a bowl of water. They looked at each other in the hush after the stone touched dust. He rested both hands on the slab like a craftsman on a workbench and tilted his head as if listening to the earth speak. "You look cold," he said, though the day was hot. His voice had the straight lines of someone who had already decided what needed doing. She stared, slow to remember how to shape syllables. "I'm not cold. Cold can get you in the middle of the day," he replied. "Gets you in the heart first. You have shelter." She lifted one shoulder toward a lopsided lean-to jammed between two boulders. The wind had chewed it to a broken smile. He studied it, then the cliffs, then the ribbon of a dried creek, then the sky with its miserliness of clouds. "Stone's right," he murmured. "You can hear it ring when you knock. A good edge, strong bedding plains. Sandstone here, basalt littled in. The valley knows how to stand. It's just been waiting for a reason." "There's no reason," she said. "Everyone who had reasons went away." He considered her as though the answer were in her face. "What about you? You stayed." "My mother is buried here," she said, and then blinked as if the sentence had walked out of her without asking permission, "and everywhere else was farther. That's reason enough." He lifted the slab. "I'll start." "Start what?" "Home." She laughed, a sound brittle with disuse. "For who?" "For the person who's still here." He hoisted the slab and walked past her, footsteps sure. He had the look of someone who made gravity negotiate. He chose a patch of earth just off the wind's main road and knelt, pressed his palm flat and closed his eyes. When he opened them, the decision was made. He carved a shallow bed with a pry bar and bare strength, placed that first slab, tapped it until the tone sweetened, and began another journey that didn't require distance. He worked as if the day were brief and the task had been waiting centuries, with hands and tools you could buy or make or break, with breath that never wasted itself on complaint. She watched from her rock. The sound of stone on stone filled the valley like heartbeats in a body waking from a long sleep. Toward evening he lit a fire, shielded it with a half-ring of rocks that needed only to be asked to become a hearth. The flames colored the cliff faces bronze and rust. He glanced over. "You can sleep by the heat," he said. "Wind will try to talk you into dying if you let it." "Why do you care?" she asked. He nudged a coal into the center like a teacher directing a shy child. "Because I'm here and you're here and the night gets cold. That's enough reason for me." She stayed awake a long time, staring at the fire, letting its small, sane crackle drown the big loneliness. When sleep finally unhooked her, it did it gently for the first time in months. At dawn he was up, washing in a trickle off a rock, checking the stone's temper with the same quiet concentration as you'd check a friend's bandage. He measured distances with his stride, marked lines with a splinter of charcoal, carried, cut, placed. No wasted motion. She stood and brought him water in a scavenged gourd. He drank with gratitude that wasn't noisy and handed the gourd back like a promise. "Name?" he asked, not looking up from aligning two stubborn edges. She considered, thought of ghosts and dust. "I had one," she said. "It broke." "Broken things can still be used," he replied. "Take your time, I'm called Ezra." "Ezra." She tested it as if it were a tool. By the third day, a low ring of stone broke the wind and made a place out of a patch. By the fifth, Ezra had cut a doorway that faced the least cruel direction and pinned it with a lintel that wouldn't argue with time. He mixed clay with crushed basalt until it behaved like loyally lifted stones into courses that trusted each other. She found herself bringing water before he asked, moving small rocks where he'd need them next. He'd nod, teach without declaring himself a teacher. "See how the grain runs," he said, showing her where a stone wanted to cleave and where it wanted to hold. "If you work with a thing's nature, most of the work is already done. What if its nature is to fall apart?" she asked. "Then you give it a structure that lets it be itself and still stay together." He spread the weight of truth so evenly in his voice that she had to meet it. She learned his silences, the one that measured, the one that mourned, the one that listened to a future arriving slowly. She learned where to set a wedge so it sang before it split. She learned that tired doesn't always mean stop and hungry doesn't always mean you have nothing. People had passed through the valley with devices and claims and polished words. Ezra arrived with hands and stayed. They ate roots and dried meat from his pack at first, then shoots she found where shadows kept secrets. He said little about where he'd walked from. North was all. Through cities that forgot how to be cities. He said he had tried to settle once in a town that wanted walls but not responsibility, and had left when the talk turned to guns instead of gardens. She asked if he was a soldier. He shook his head. "I build things," he said. "Sometimes that makes me fight, but building is the point." The roof fell during a sandstorm that arrived like a chorus of knives. Wind shrieked, grit stung, stones trembled as if remembering old earthquakes. Ezra and the girl held the frame with rope and weight and will until a gust unseated a slab and the structure folded halfway. When the storm went silent out of sheer boredom with their stubbornness, she stared at the damage and felt the old despair climb her spine, smooth and confident. "It's broken," she said. "Good lesson," Ezra answered, smiling with dust stuck to his teeth. "It told us what it needs. We'll give it that. Are you not afraid it will happen again?" "Everything happens again," he said, "but we can be better when it does." He looked at the sky. "We'll push deeper into the cliff anchor to what doesn't want to move. We'll give the roof more pitch, stitch the seams with ribbing. The wind can keep its voice and we'll keep our roof." He slept an hour and went back to work. She worked beside him because her body remembered something that had outlived fear, the satisfaction of fitting one necessity to another until they locked like hands. They were not alone for long. The first traveler arrived as if summoned by the sound of hammers, a woman with a burned shoulder who kept staring too long toward horizons, the way someone does who has left graves behind her. Ezra gave her water, not from charity but from habit. He showed her the leeward side of the new wall to sleep. He didn't ask questions she didn't want to answer. In the morning she mended a tear in the girl's wrap with precise fingers, and left them a bundle of seeds as payment no one demanded. Word goes faster than feet when it's good. By the season's turn, other wanderers traced paths to the valley. A man with a useless radio cradled like a child. A pair of cousins who knew which weeds meant water hid nearby. A boy who could coax music from a tin whistle and had a laugh that made tired men feel young for 3 breaths. Ezra received all of them the same way, with boundaries and generosity in equal measure. He taught the willing how to split a stone and honor it, how to lay a terrace that turned a slope into a stair, how to listen to the wind and then build where it couldn't lie as easily. The girl learned more than techniques. She learned that you could borrow strength from a task, that doing the necessary thing in front of you was a way of speaking to despair in a language it couldn't answer. One evening, as they watched the light slide off the cliffs, she said, "I didn't know people could be like this." "Like what?" Ezra asked, as if staying is a kind of courage. He nodded. "Most battles are just the long staying." "Why did you come here, Ezra?" "Because the map I kept in my head had a hole in it and it looked like this place. I couldn't stand the hole anymore." "You mean you were curious?" "I mean I was responsible," he said, but his mouth softened at the edges. They named the house together without speaking a name. It was the house. It had a hearth whose stones looked like they belonged together. It had a floor made of compacted earth stiffened with lime that Ezra burned himself from quarried limestone. It had a roof whose beams were pegged and notched and braced like bones. It had a door she could close and be something other than prey. She told him about her mother one night, voice steady as if the story was a job to do. How the fever had taken its time, polite, pretending to be a small thing until it became everything. How her mother had told her to leave, and she had said no because leaving meant the earth would forget the shape of the woman who had taught her to sing to water. How the graves in the dry creek held not just body but vocabulary, and she was afraid to lose the words. "You didn't," Ezra said. "You build them into the wall now. That's what we do with our dead. We carry them as structure." She watched the fire reflect in his eyes and thought she saw a city burning there and a bridge falling and a child's face he didn't talk about. She said nothing more. Trouble came, trouble always answers whenever hope says hello. It entered on wheels, engine noise dragging dust like a dirty cape, metal plates welded onto old frames, men and women who wore hunger like a crest. The takers, they called themselves, because if you explain your intentions plainly, decent people sometimes disbelieve you. The leader had a jaw that chewed side to side like a dog that had learned to eat bone. His left cheek was tin, his right had too many scars. "Nice place," he said, gesturing with a rifle whose stock had teeth marks. "Belongs to us now." Ezra stood with his hammer upright like a staff. "No," he answered as if declining extra food. The leader grinned, showing a row of metal caps. "You alone?" The girl stepped forward, rope coiled around her waist, eyes that had stared down too many dawns to blink easily. Travelers stood behind them, not brave but unwilling to let their hands forget how to make fists. The takers laughed because it's easier than fear. They came like falling shelves, loud and convinced of their own gravity. Ezra moved the way a boulder moves when it finally decides to obey the planet, slow, unstoppable, prepared to crush whatever forgets the rules of mass. The first who reached him bounced off the head of the hammer and stayed down to think about decisions. The second got too close and learned that a builder's hands know how to dismantle as well as assemble. The girl used the rope to pull a raider's ankle out from under him the way she had once trapped goats when they wandered high, and the traveler with the burned shoulder jammed a crowbar into the gears of an improvised bike until it screamed and died. Dust and shouting and the hot smell of fear rose like a second storm. When the rifles fired, Ezra went behind the low wall he'd built earlier because defending is also design. Bullets shattered stone into hot chips that hissed. He waited, counted, moved, struck. He took a crease across the scalp and another along the ribs, and the pain made him precise instead of wild. The fight wasn't elegant. It was stubborn, and in the end the takers weren't built to stay. When their leader saw a line they couldn't push, he did what such men always do. He declared it a temporary withdrawal and made it look like strategy. The valley fell back into silence, broken only by groans and the panting of people who had discovered their own hearts. Ezra leaned against the doorpost, smearing blood across wood, and sank to the ground as if remembering how to be heavy. "You're hurt," the girl said. Her hands shook as she wrapped linen around his ribs. He hissed when she tightened it, then smiled like someone who's been shown proof of something they had hoped might be true. "Wall held," he said. "So did you." She looked at the settlement, a big word for a house and some windbreaks, and felt the moment slip its skin and step out as something new. "What are we going to do when they come back? Be the same but better," Ezra said, "and ask people to stand with us who need a place to stand." They built a watch floor atop the wall, a bell made from the rim of a broken machine wheel, two shelters that could become one if you dropped a curtain and braced it. They carved channels so rain, when it finally came, would feed a cistern that made water stay against its will. They set stones that would break the line of any vehicle trying to enter where it shouldn't, not traps, just stubborn truths embedded in the earth. The next time the takers returned, they found a valley where arrival and defeat had to share a doorstep, and neither wanted to embarrass itself. After a short, rude conversation with physics, they left again. This time they did not promise to return soon. Travelers started to plan their route to include a stop. They'd spend 2 nights, leave a tool or a story, carry away a bag of dried roots and a little peace. Someone hung a clay amulet over the doorway with a sun impressed into it, and when the wind pushed at the charm, it clicked like language. Someone else painted a broad handprint on the wall at shoulder height. The boy with the whistle played, while children tried on the idea of laughter. Ezra made a habit of noticing where hands had rested and built benches there, as if capturing the shape of companionship before it wandered off again. The girl learned to speak to groups without feeling like a thief stealing the crowd's patience. She taught, too, how to read the shadow of a cliff to find coolness beneath, how to follow ant trails to sweet water, how to put a roof beam in with humor, because if you don't enjoy it, you're doing it wrong. People started calling her Stone Warden in the half-joking, half-true way communities named their anchors. She answered to it more easily than she'd expected. The old names might have fallen away, but the valley had given her a new one that fit like a tool handle smoothed by many hands. One winter a child was born in the house, red-faced and astonished by its own breath. The mother had come heavy-bellied and determined, carrying 2 blankets that held the shape of a grandmother's needles. The baby's first cry echoed into the cliff and then returned, twice as strong, as if the earth had decided to keep this voice. Ezra wept where no one could see. The girl didn't hide it. She had discovered that tears can water useful things if you're careful where you pour them. They named the place without voting, Stone Haven. People arriving could feel the name waiting for them in the air, like heat from a sun you couldn't see yet. Not all days were building. Some were repairing. Some were sitting with grief when it wouldn't be hurried. Some were making solder from tin scavenged out of machines, or powdering herbs to make what passed for medicine. But if you asked what the valley did, the answer was the same. It built. It took pieces of a world that had tried to fall apart and convinced them to trust one another again. It harvested trust like a crop, slowly, with care, knowing each season could also be a famine if you forgot how quickly hope dries. Once, as dusk pooled and the sky bruised purple, the girl asked Ezra, "Do you miss the cities?" "I miss the density," he said, "not the crowds, the way possibility is thick in the air. But I've learned how to make that density by hand, takes longer, holds better." "Why do humans always keep going?" she asked. She wasn't human, not in the way the old books would have measured it. Her pupils a touch wider, her bones a touch lighter, a hint of dusk blue when she stood in very cold shade. Her people had traded with humans when trading was still a thing. They had shared songs and seeds and then parted to their different worlds. The drought had not asked for passports. It had taken evenly, Ezra considered. Because stopping means the deadness wins twice, he said. Once when it takes what it takes, and again when we help it by not mending the whole. "And aren't you tired of mending?" "Yes," he said, "but not as tired as I'd be if the whole stayed." They survived a sickness that wandered through like a stray dog looking for a place to sleep. They survived a drier year that cracked lips and then split promises. In those months, Ezra taught the valley how to write its memory in durable lines, not with paper that mold could eat, but with incised marks on slate, with grooves on bamboo pipes that were also music, with stories drilled into children's bones. A wall remembers the hands that lifted it, he would say. Let your work tell your name even if your mouth is gone. He grew older the way stone ages slowly, with honesty. His hair silvered until the sun mistaken it for frost. He didn't stop lifting, he just chose where to put his strength with more cunning. He taught more and reached for his hammer less. The girl, the woman, filled spaces he chose to leave empty for her. He watched her stand on a ridge and direct a crew and thought of a shipbuilder in a city that was now dust, told himself that memories are also beams you can lay across distances. The day the sky gave back water, thunder rolled like old drums and the valley lifted its face as if hearing its name. Rain battered the roofs and the roof stayed proud. Channels filled and then sang. The cistern drank like a grateful old horse. Earth sagged into soft and then remembered how to cradle seeds. Children ran in it until they shook from cold, laughing like coins ringing in a jar you thought empty. Ezra stood in the doorway and let it soak him until he looked young again for a moment. The woman who had been lonely let it wash her and didn't cry because sometimes joy is too big for the old ways. That night, the settlement gathered around the great hearth, and Ezra told a story he had saved too long, about a bridge that once spanned a canyon bigger than this whole valley, its cables singing even when wind slept, its deck broad enough for 2 herds to pass without bumping horns. He told how the bridge had fallen when a war told it to fall, and how he had carried a bolt from that bridge in his pack for years without knowing why. He set the bolt on the stone mantle. Now I know, he said, not to remember the fall, but to remember that once people thought it was right to join 2 cliffs and call them neighbors. He slept well that night. He slept well many nights after, until the day he didn't wake. He died like a finished job does, tools wrapped, workbench swept, last piece fitted so neatly that anyone who saw it leaned back and exhaled a little without knowing why. They buried him under the first course of the first wall, the one that had turned wind into something to sing to. They carved his name into the lintel in letters he had taught them because he had insisted, and they put no words after it but one, builder. The woman stood before the stone and couldn't speak, the way you can't talk when a storm has knocked your voice back into your lungs. After a while she found the sentence that would carry the next day into this one. "Watch us," she whispered, and the wind pressed against her cheek like a father's hand. Grief walked the valley for a year and then decided to stay as a resident who paid rent by making everyone kinder. The settlement learned how to begin without waiting for Ezra to tell them which end of a rope to hold. The woman took the bell's rope when trouble gathered and gave it to others when peace did. She laughed more now. It sounded like hammers. Children grew into people with back muscles and opinions. The boy with the whistle taught other boys and girls to breathe music into metal, and they learned it was a way to keep a rhythm when lifting hurt. The woman planted a small grove of trees where a crack in the bedrock kept a secret of water, and she set stones around each trunk to prevent goats from telling the trees that life is unfair. She named each tree for someone who had left, so when she watered them, she spoke with ghosts in a cheerful voice. Visitors from the sky came at last, like a memory returning in a vehicle that knew how to answer gravity differently. The ship descended slow, silvered with old burned scars, the kind of craft that a big civilization would call obsolete and a good mechanic would call beautiful. The pilot stepped out with hands raised, palms empty. She was human, but not the way Ezra had been. She had tattoos that moved like small rivers to show her heart rate, an ear filled with tools, and eyes with film across them that could count particles if you asked nicely. "We've heard of a place that stands," the pilot said. "We came to see if the rumor was shaped like truth." The woman welcomed her as Ezra would have, with boundaries and generosity and tasks that revealed a guest's character. The pilot helped mend a wall and banged her thumb and swore in a language that tasted like cinnamon. She listened to the valley talk about itself and didn't offer to improve them. When she asked to trade, she offered seeds that grew in dust and a vial of something that kept fever from stealing names. In return, the woman gave her a small brick, fired clay stamped with a handprint. "Carry this," she said. "If anyone asks where you got it, tell them you traded for a story." "What story?" the pilot asked. "That a human built a house of stone and left us the shape of how to keep going," the woman replied. "You'd be surprised how many hungry people will cross a desert to hear that one." The pilot promised to carry the brick until someone needed the story more than she did. She lifted into the sky like a lantern going to look for the lost. Sometime later, other ships came. Some came because they wanted to sell things to people who stood still. Some came because their maps had holes and a rumor of stone filled them. Some came because they were tired of running and wanted to learn how to stay. The valley greeted each with careful welcome and a schedule. The world beyond, with its planets and treaties and corporate claims and wars that called themselves operations to make blood behave, took note of a single valley that insisted on outlasting vocabulary. There were invitations, delegations, offers to turn Stonehaven into a project with logos. The woman listened, smiled, and shook her head until they sent different people with quieter voices. She told them they were welcome to share water and learn, and then asked them to help lift, because muscles make better allies than proposals. One visitor stayed who wasn't human, a machine with legs like a nervous deer and a voice from somewhere older than both of them. It had been a survey unit once, tasked with counting rock and water and the sadness of the sky. It had watched armies pass and had learned patience the hard way. "I can remember accurately," it said, "but I cannot remember tenderly. I would like to learn that." "You can sit by the hearth," the woman told it, "and we will teach you which parts of the record deserve soft edges." The machine listened for seasons and then began to tell stories with pauses in the right places. It learned to ask for repetition not because of error, but because of the human pleasure of hearing familiar things again. It became the valley's archivist and would sometimes hum old songs in a tone as steady as rain on stone. One drought tried to kill them all, the kind that moves like a bureaucrat through your days, politely taking one necessity after another until you have none. The cistern dropped its water level until the bottom revealed old tools people had promised themselves they wouldn't forget. Children grew quiet. Tongues cracked. Hope wore thin spots where it had been handled too much. The woman stood where the creek remembered movement and thought of giving up because sometimes the mind offers that as the only obvious solution to a difficult math. Then she remembered Ezra's way of putting one necessity next to the other until they matched. They went to the heights and carved a catchment ladder into the cliff, a series of pockets that taught a reluctant cloud how to linger. They strung canvas and net to persuade due to consider becoming a citizen. They dug 2 wells where the machine said the ground sounded softer. People who could sing sang while they dug because rhythm is water for the muscles. They opened caches that Ezra had buried with annoying foresight stones that had become jars of seeds that became bowls of food that became hours not dying. The drought ended because they were still alive to see it end. Years made a pattern of themselves and then casually unwove it and made another. The woman's hair silvered. The lines in her face took up permanent residence and framed her smile until it looked like a planned thing. Children called her warden as naturally as they called the sky big. She would wake before dawn and walk the perimeter just to make sure it existed. Along the way she would touch each wall like you touch a child's brow to check for fever. She kept Ezra's hammer above the hearth and took it down sometimes, not to use, but to hold because weight remembers the hand. One night a new kind of visitor arrived. Not raiders, not traders. A column of glow moved down the far ridge, hover sleds carrying a terrarium of light. The machines wore the logo of a company that had bought the rights to half a continent on a planet where rights were things you could sell if you had enough ships to pretend they were real. The lead sled landed and opened the door. A woman stepped out in clean boots and the smile of someone who believes deep down she is the hero of her own documentary. "We're here to integrate you," she said. "Our firm has a vision for regional resilience. We can bring desalination rigs from orbit, soil organics from distant stations, 20,000 liters of do-gooding. We can brand your hopes and make them scalable." The woman listened, and then knelt to show the polite visitor how to test a stone's readiness with a tap. She asked if the firm's vision included the patience to lift 1,000 rocks and then stand them together until the wind changed its mind. The visitor explained that patience could be automated. Stonehaven met the firm with the same answer it gave drought, plague, and noise, a shape that refused to break. They thanked the company for its offers and asked it to send scientists with better questions, or else to send nothing. It took several visits and some tears before the firm agreed to leave the valley alone and carry its improvements to places that had already decided to be improved. The woman stood on the ridge afterward and watched the glow fade, and felt the hard, warm satisfaction of having defended not just a place but a way. Sometimes she sat alone where Ezra had set the first slab and asked him what he thought of her decisions. She did not hear words. She didn't need to. The wind moved through the canyon, and if it sounded like approval, well, winds can lie, but stone rarely does. One summer she found a child at the edge of the settlement, crouched near a thorn bush that still had ambitions. The child looked like hunger had drawn a map from wrist to shoulder. The woman squatted, slow and unscary, and offered a piece of flatbread. "Where are your people?" she asked. "Gone," the child said, as if reporting the weather. "What's your name?" The child's face took on the guarded blank of someone who has learned that names are currencies you should hold until the market improves. "You don't have to tell me yet," the woman said. "You can keep it safe until you decide we won't spend it carelessly." The child followed her into the valley without deciding to. Days later, the child stood in front of Ezra's hammer and asked, very softly, "Why do you keep old things?" "Because we are old things," the woman answered, and the child nodded slowly, as if a big thought had crawled up onto the bank and lay there, drying and becoming something new. The child learned to cut stone and to read rain and to sleep without fear of strangers, because strangers had become people with names and jokes and the habit of helping. The child took up a chisel one evening and tapped shallow letters into the base of the hearth, while no one pretended to watch. You didn't need to read them to know what they spelled. The machine with deer legs recorded 100 hours of lullabies, and the recipes for 2 soups, and the procedures for stitching a wound, and 5 ways to be kind when you are exhausted. It asked the woman to tell the story of the first day again, the day a human had come carrying a slab heavier than what was wise. She told it, and the machine asked if human stories always start with someone doing something too heavy for them. She laughed and said, "Yes, that was our brand." Ships continued. Seasons continued. People came and stayed and came and left and came and died and stayed in a different way. The valley became as sure as hunger, as generous as a grandparent slipping a coin into your hand for no reason. Sometimes the woman would wake at night and worry that she had held the place too tightly, had turned a home into a monument, had taught her people to be stone when they should have been water. She would walk until she found a small thing growing where it absolutely shouldn't, a flower in a crack, a conversation between 2 who had once hated, a child teaching a machine to skip, and she would remember that stone is not the opposite of life. It is the vessel that holds it while the wind throws tantrums. The wider galaxy finally noticed properly, not because a report crossed a desk or a sensor pinged something profitable, but because a ship lost its way and found it again by looking down, and seeing a geometry of roofs that made mathematical sense to a mind that needed a pattern to remember what hope looks like. A message went out to Ngo, to regimes, to smugglers with complicated ethics, that there was a valley on a struggling world where people managed to stand. In a universe where conquering was the favorite verb, standing was news. An envoy from a federation that had better days asked the woman to send delegates to speak on a committee about post-collapse resilience. She sent 2 teenagers instead of herself, because teenagers tell the truth rudely and committees need that. They came back with stories of lights and fear, and a feeling like swimming in a big cold sea with boats nearby that might rescue or might run you under. They said the committee had asked for a manual. The Valley wrote 50 pages of instructions on how to set a foundation, and 50 more on how to forgive someone who stole bread during a hunger, because forgiveness is also a load-bearing wall. A decade wore out, and the woman's step shortened. She stopped climbing every ridge. She directed a build from a chair in the shade. She told the child, now less child than architect, to take the hammer sometimes and feel its weight without lifting it. If it feels like it belongs to you, you're carrying your own legend too soon, she said. Use it, then put it back. She walked to Ezra's stone less often but talked more when she got there. She told him the jokes he would have liked and the mistakes she had made because he liked those too. I said yes to a thing I should have said no to, she confessed once. But we built around the mistake and now it looks like a choice. She slept and woke and slept 12 more times, then one morning she didn't wake. She left instructions to be buried with hands wrapped around a seed, a large seed from a tree that didn't know this soil yet but could learn, and for people to sing not the sad songs but the sturdy ones. They obeyed and disobeyed perfectly, crying while they sang, placing her where Ezra could still hear her. The tree grew. The roots went down into memory, and the leaves reached up into stories no one had told yet. After that day, the valley didn't close like a mouth around a lost tooth. It widened like a river mouth that has learned the ocean exists. People took what Stonehaven knew and carried it into places that wanted it. A clan crossed the northern flats and made a smaller haven around a spring that had cousins with the one in the valley. A group went west and taught wind to be polite with a fence that was more conversation than obstacle. A pair of lovers took plans and seeds and stories to a city that wanted to live again, and the city believed them because their hands had scars in the right places. The machine archivist became an elder. Its voice developed a tremor when telling the part about the first slab because even metal can learn to feel the weight of something it didn't lift. It painted with light at night on the walls, moving diagrams of water and trust, so children could chase shapes and adults could point and nod. One evening many years later, a procession descended from the eastern pass with lanterns held high. Visitors came on foot, not because their ships had failed, but because they had decided to approach the way a lesson approaches a student respectfully. At their head walked a woman with a pilot's swagger, older now, with tattoos that had faded and been repainted, eyes that had watched more ships depart than arrive. I carried the brick, she told the gathered. I traded it 5 times, and each time it bought a story that paid for work. There are places now with walls that lilt like yours and roofs that refuse the wind and doors that are stubbornly open. I came to say thank you and to ask for more. The valley offered her bread and a brief lecture on the immorality of taking more than you need, then gave her everything she asked for because she had brought back proof that giving works. That night, under a sky the color of old metal, people told the story again. The narrator changed from line to line, a child here, a mechanic there, the machine chiming in when memory needed a nudge. They spoke of the day a girl had been homeless and a human had put down a slab of stone and called gravity a partner. They spoke of raids endured, roofs rebuilt, tears shaded and then tasted and then saved for soup. They spoke of a hammer that had killed and built but mostly built, of hands that had not been able to stop because stopping would have been a lie. Beyond the valley, the galaxy didn't stop being cruel. Armies still marched, laws still bent toward whoever held the heaviest purse, and small lives were still stepped on by large boots. But the valley had a shape now that could be traced like a template, and people who had only ever known how to run learned how to angle their flight into landing. Not everywhere, not overnight. Enough. A child, born in the rain year and grown into someone who could sit still beside a problem until it confessed, asked the machine one morning, "What exactly did Ezra teach us? Was it just stones?" The machine, word considered, hummed an old work song. "He taught that matter can be persuaded," it said, "and so can days. He taught that tired is not the same as finished, and that fear is not a blueprint. He taught that the opposite of broken is not perfect, it's repaired. And he taught that building is a plural verb." The child nodded as if they hadn't expected the answer, and it was exactly what they had expected. Ships came again with flags that claimed to represent something large and complicated with an anthem. A war was starting far away in places whose names sounded like broken glass. Refugees poured outward. The valley read the incoming light as it would read a cloud and took steps. They built 3 rings of new homes that could be homes or hospitals. They rerouted the catchment ladder to teach it to grow. They asked lucky people to be generous and generous people to be lucky. They took in as many as they could hold and then taught those people to make more space. The war went on. The valley continued to prefer roofs to trenches. One night, 20 years after the woman had returned to the soil with a seed between her hands, lightning cracked the dead mountain and a fire began. It ate toward the grove with the method and appetite of everything that has never learned to apologize. The valley fought it with lines and water and backburns and prayers. The woman's tree stood with flames licking her leaves, and then the wind turned because wind is not a god. It's air with habits. Morning found the tree blackened and alive, smoke whispering out of seams, bark blistered, sap hardened to amber that would hold insects and stories for 1,000 years. Children gathered and touched the snags with reverent fingers. The machine recorded their small, amazed noises, filed the moment under proof. The archivist's favorite file was still the first day. It would play it sometimes when no one asked, not in sound, but in the sight of a figure walking out of dust carrying a slab, in the sound of stone accepting another stone, in the face of a girl who had nothing left but a stubborn refusal to let nothing be the end of it. The machine would shine that scene big on the wall, and the valley would sit and watch until the fire burned down to friendly, and the stars salted the dark and silence joined them like an old friend who knew when to be quiet. A message came from the Federation that had better days, asking Stonehaven to send someone to speak at a convocation where important people would agree with each other in principle, and then disagree in specifics until the meal went cold. The valley sent the archivist. It arrived with a wagon full of bricks, each stamped with a handprint, each swapped for a promise to build something that wasn't a weapon. It recorded who took a brick and later returned with pictures of new walls. It also recorded who set the brick on their desk as art. The machine didn't judge, it simply filed. Judging was for wind and gravity and hunger. People either learned or they broke. Old men and women sat with the machine sometimes, hand on its cool metal flank, and told it about how Ezra had held his head when he listened, the exact rhythm of his walk, the way he didn't hurry the moment a beam settled into its pocket, because respect is a tool you use on time. The machine updated the record with these small, expensive details. Children watched bored, until boredom learned it was in the presence of something bigger than a story. It was the blueprint for being a person. On the 1,000th turning since a human brought a slab to a valley, a storm rolled in from the west with a humorless face. The sky was a bruise, the lightning stitched it like an incompetent doctor, the rain came sideways, the roofs held, The terraces held. The bell sang once, twice, then stopped because it had been braced by someone who remembered too many nights of being surprised. The old wall, the first wall, took the wind and curved it and sent it away. Stones that had been fit together by hands that shook from fatigue did not shake now. The storm flung itself at the idea of the valley and then broke like theater. In the morning, the settlement emerged, wet and irritated, to count damages and blessings, which were the same list in a different order. The woman's tree shook itself and sent 1,000,000 drops onto the heads below, a kind of sacrament. A child ran along the wall and shouted the day's news, which was that roofs leaked exactly where roofs like to leak, and that was evidence that life goes on. A traveler from a new town asked the archivist to tell the story once more. The machine projected the beginning on the cliff: dust, a girl, a man with a stone. Everyone was quiet because the first time was a holy sight. Somewhere in the back, an infant cried and was comforted. Somewhere in front, an old man coughed and was given tea. Somewhere in the middle, a person who had wanted to leave for years decided to stay for one more day, and then decided that again tomorrow, and then again, and found that staying is a road like any other. You just don't move sideways along it. The story ended the way it always ends, with the first door standing. The machine dimmed, the fire huffed, the wind found no purchase. The valley settled into itself like a person into a chair that has survived everything. And that day the galaxy learned humanity doesn't conquer, it endures. Headphone, thank you for listening. Until next time, stay human, stay unbroken.